military matters now, and around 100,000 Russian troops are believed to be stationed along its border with Ukraine. Now, despite this looking like preparation for an invasion to those in the West, Russia has told America that it is absolutely not the case after officials from both countries met for sky-high talks in Geneva yesterday.
I suppose the big question is whether or not they can be trusted. Will Geddes is a security and terror expert here to give us his take on it all. Is that, that can we trust their word, that they're not building up troops on the border because of any what's the word I'm looking for? It's just escaping me.
Malintent.
Malintent, exactly.
To a certain extent, yes. I mean, for them to actually effectively invade Ukraine, they would need probably 3 times the number. You're looking more like 350, 400,000 troops. So 100,000 is, I think, more of a demonstration of resilience and being robust, because there's this huge concern about NATO imposing into Ukraine the capabilities to potentially launch missiles into Russia, and equally NATO's worried about Russia getting into Ukraine and having the ability to launch missiles.
So why don't they both just stay out of Ukraine? Would that not make everyone happy?
Well, fundamentally, it's a long story, obviously going back to 1991, which was when obviously Ukraine sort of declared its independence, and they removed obviously Russia's missiles around 1995 as a promise for their sovereignty. So they're now in a position where they want to be part of the EU because they want the free trade agreement. They want the capabilities and the luxuries obviously afforded to them by the EU. But Russia is concerned that obviously if they do sign up to NATO, and bearing in mind in these NATO talks, we've also got Sweden and Finland, who also have borders with Russia, attending these NATO talks in Geneva. Everyone's a bit concerned because Russia has been a little bit naughty in terms of some of its intrusion into those territories. I mean, obviously Crimea speaks for itself, but I'm talking more about, say, submarines, talking about aircraft.
You're talking about intrusion into UK territory.
Correct, yes.
Well,
yeah.
So when you talk about submarines, this came up this week, that the head of the armed forces warned about this. And so basically they're looking at cables that bring information to us, that bring energy supplies to us, that have technology in terms of computers and whatever. Yeah. And why are those susceptible?
Well, they're susceptible because they run pretty much on the seabed. And there's been a lot of submarine activity by the Russians into areas which they shouldn't have been in by the Russian naval sort of elements. So there are concerns that it could obviously cause huge disruptions to us on a more sort of covert level. Again, not visible to the general public, something which is very much, in a literal sense, beneath the surface. However, it could cause huge disruptions for us. In the same way as Russia also supplies about a quarter of the natural gas into Europe, 80% of that has been through the Ukraine, but they're now diverting it through the Turkish pipeline. Now, Ukraine were tapping some of that gas off to feed its own domestic needs. Yeah. So Ukraine is in an incredibly difficult spot. But equally, what we're not hearing a lot about in the news is about Belarus. And Belarus, which is also on the border of Ukraine and the border of Russia, is sandwiches between the two, is having troops obviously already incurring there.
But, well, why does the West leave a lot of these countries, including ourselves, vulnerable to energy security coming from Russia? I know a lot of it ends up in Germany, and then a little bit less comes to us, but it still impacts on us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a long chain of obviously power supply which comes from countries like Russia, which have huge natural resources. So they have the capability to be able to provide that. And again, one of the concerns which could come out of this Geneva talk is that if Ukraine is not left alone and maintained its sovereignty and its independence to do as it wishes, and NATO has an agreement that anybody can join them, potentially, is that there could be very severe sanctions imposed on Russia, which is only going to aggravate situations more.
Yes, so then that puts all the more impetus on the importance of these talks in Geneva, not least because, it could affect our power supplies here in the UK if they aren't able to de-escalate things. But as you say, the tensions are ramping up. We've seen how Russia's behaved in places like Crimea. They aren't afraid to take military action if and when they're pushed. Could you see this escalating militarily?
I think it could do. I think in the short term, maybe not so much on the separatist side. We've seen, obviously, Russian separatists, and we've got to bear in mind that since 2014, there have been some 10,000 Ukrainians that have been killed in those actions. So that kind of level of guerrilla warfare may be on hold temporarily whilst there's a large troop presence, obviously, on the border. However, that could return. And again, the disruption, the mayhem this causes for the poor Ukrainians could be astronomical.
What I don't understand is why we're seeing tanks and guns and we're worried about those in helicopters and whatever, when the Russians have the nuclear option and the West has the nuclear option.
Well, there's this thing called the INF Treaty, which was this agreement put in place by Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev back here in the 80s, I think it was, the late 80s, which was about short-range missiles, which were land-based, that could launch between 300 and 3,500 miles. Now, that was broken, that treaty was broken down by Trump when he believed that the Russians were moving these capabilities closer to the border of Ukraine. And it was a mutual agreement. Now, fundamentally, if Russia was moving its capability closer, that means they could launch attacks into Europe and into major capitals in Europe pretty easily, bearing in mind that sort of distance. So that's broken down, and it's a question of reassurances from Russia that they will not have those capabilities close enough to obviously cause or create those problems.
Gosh, an incredibly serious situation. If you're to look at this from a sort of Hawkeye perspective, who has the trump card in all of this? Is it ultimately Russia? Because, frankly, they hold the keys to the taps and we're all facing this cost of living crisis. They know that if sanctions are imposed on them, they can just turn off the taps completely.
Well, they could, but I don't think that's going to cause huge amounts. I think it would cause, yes, some significant disruption. But not being a gas expert, I couldn't necessarily give you the truly accurate picture. But I think fundamentally it's just going to be this constant rattling of sabres between the two. And unfortunately, poor Ukraine has been caught in the middle of this whole situation. They want to have their independence. They want to join the EU. They need to have the ability to join NATO. But equally, it's about withdrawal of troops from both sides. Yeah. We have troops in in Ukraine. Russia has troops up on the border. Again, this needs to de-escalate, but it needs to de-escalate with assurances.
You talk about de-escalation and the threat of war. Isn't the truth that we're already at war when you look at cyber war and you look at what's going on now with these exercises and various, all sorts of sleight of hand going on? Are we not constantly engaged in war?
The Cold War, by some, has never ended. The Cold War, I mean, certainly the mounting of troops, the number of troops that are on the border right now of Ukraine, is the highest number that they've had since the Cold War. But you're absolutely right. It's this subterfuge. It's this more clandestine war of cyber intelligence and hacking, and whether it be Cozy Bear or various other independent cyber threats that may or may not be state-sponsored, that are launching these attacks, obviously, into the UK, into Europe, into the United States. And also, as you mentioned, very relevantly, Eamon, about this potential attack on data lines and supply lines and power supply lines, obviously, on the seabeds. So there are many, many different ways that they can chip away at us. But equally, we need to stand firm. We need to be resilient.
Well, scary.
Yeah,
Scary.
frankly.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Security expert Will Geddes there.